When you lose everything in a single, brutal sweep, your job, your home, the person you trusted most, the world either breaks you or it becomes the hammer you use to build something stronger. I learned that the hard way, and what followed was a slow, deliberate transformation that looked a lot like revenge but felt, deep down, like reclaiming my life. The morning it began is burned into me like an ember that never goes out. I woke up to sunlight cutting across the kitchen table and the quiet hum of a house that felt suddenly foreign. She sat there, fingers scrolling her phone, and the distance between us was palpable. For 5 years I had poured myself into my work at her father's company, early mornings, late nights, unpaid favors, loyalty that I thought was reciprocated because I was family now. I had believed, perhaps foolishly, that the title of son-in-law came with a shield. Instead, it was the thing that made me invisible. The call to his office felt like a scene from someone else's life, his cold desk, his clipped words. The envelope slid across like an executioner's note. "We're letting you go," he said, as though he were apologizing for the weather. There was no conversation, no warning, no dignity, just the echo of the door closing behind me and a hollow in my chest where certainty used to be. At home I sought comfort and found indifference. I told her what happened and watched the softness drain from her face. "Maybe it's for the best," she said, like a judge passing sentence. And in that moment I realized I had been nothing but convenient, a hired extension of a family brand, easily replaced. The following nights were a blur of job applications, half-hearted interviews, and the slow realization that the woman I married had already checked out. She stopped answering the little things that had mattered, the texts that used to make me smile, the casual questions at dinner. Weeks later there was a suitcase by the door and a note that read like a diagnosis: "I can't do this anymore." No argument, no fight, no attempt to mend what was broken, only an exit as clean and unemotional as a business transaction. The irony that she left me the way her father had let me go was not lost on me. For a while I sank. Nights became longer and the apartment felt like a museum of who I used to be. I took odd jobs, fixed neighbors' leaky faucets, delivered food, anything to keep the lights on. Pride was a quiet animal that I kept caged. But hunger does strange things to a man, hunger for dignity, for purpose, for some thread of identity that wasn't defined by someone else's opinion. I read voraciously, not novels for escape but manuals and blogs and financial white papers. I devoured podcasts at 2 in the morning about entrepreneurship, real estate, digital marketing. Slowly, clumsily, I began to stitch a new life from the torn pieces left behind. I apprenticed under a small-time property consultant online, learned how to analyze deals, how to read contracts, and how leverage actually worked. What had started as a survival instinct turned into a relentless schooling, because when you have nothing to lose, you learn to convert time and shame into capital. Opportunity, as it usually does, arrived disguised as improbability. A client who had once brushed me off came to me with a hesitant lead, a rundown property on the edge of town, unwanted, undervalued. I put every spare minute into that deal, negotiating, hammering out paperwork, learning negotiation techniques that made my palms sweat. The first small win, flipping that property for a modest profit, tasted like redemption. It bought me time, credibility, a foothold. I started taking calculated risks, a duplex here, a commercial lot there, reinvesting every penny. I hired a small team, quiet, talented people who cared more about fair opportunity than old money pedigrees. The business grew, slowly but surely, converting my grind into systems and my insomnia into strategy. Within 2 years, the company I cobbled together was making respectable returns. Within 3, we were no longer a rumor. We were an emerging presence investors wanted to understand. Meanwhile, life in their orbit changed too. Rumors drifted across the neighborhoods. The father-in-law's company was bleeding cash. Deals that used to close easily were falling through. A key investor was nervous. I don't know if his pride blinded him, or if his arrogance made him underestimate the market shifts, but the cracks were visible to anyone who bothered to look. As fate, or perhaps karma, would have it, one of the investors who was being courted to revive their business was someone I had built a relationship with during my property work. I didn't engineer the meeting with theatrics in mind. I approached it like any other business negotiation, with data, projections, and a clear value proposition. What started as a professional introduction turned into an alliance built on mutual interest. He needed reliable returns, and I had the operational skill to deliver them. When the conversation shifted toward acquisitions and restructuring, I listened more than I spoke. I learned everything I could about the debt load, the liabilities, the people who still believed their name was bulletproof. There was a moment, in the quiet of a late-night call, when the investor asked, "Would you ever consider taking a controlling stake in that company? It's messy, but the brand has recognition." My answer was practical: if it's a good deal. I studied the numbers until they lost meaning and then studied them some more. I ran scenarios where my company absorbed the failing entity and where it didn't. When the right structure emerged, ugly and beautiful at once, I pulled the trigger. Sitting in that man's office for the second time felt unreal. The sun slanted through the same blinds and painted the desk the same way. But the air was different. He had aged in the interim. The cocky set of his jaw had softened into an expression I could not quite name. Worry, perhaps. Or the dawning sense of being dethroned. I watched him as I signed the final documents that made me, technically, the person with the authority to decide the company's future. The astonishment on his face when I told him I represented the acquiring party was a private kind of justice. He tried first to bargain, to charm, to assert the old pecking order, but the legalities were airtight. The same man who had called me unfit now had to listen to my terms. In a strange mirror, I handed him a termination notice written in the same tone he had used with me years before. I could have lingered on cruelty, on humiliation, but I chose to keep it clinical. I wanted the irony, not the spectacle. My ex-wife returned like a ghost from a life I had been denied. Surprised to find me in a position of authority, she wandered into my new office, wearing the same practiced composure that had once convinced me love could conquer anything. "I heard about the acquisition," she said, as though this were water cooler gossip. "I'm proud of you." Her eyes searched me for the man she once thought she owned, the man whose failures she had counted on as proof she had been right to leave. I felt something then that I hadn't in a long time, pity, not for her, but for the ease with which she had used other people as props. My answer was a simple, steady line: "You left when the chips were down. I don't need your approval now," she faltered, words failing her, and for the first time I saw fear, not the fear of being alone, but the fear of having miscalculated who she had discarded. It is a curious sensation to watch someone realize they walked away from a man who could have been their partner, not because you wanted to punish them, but because you finally didn't need them to define you. The months that followed were a careful reconstruction, not of spite, but of stewardship. I set about fixing what was broken in that company: respectful hiring practices, transparent accounting, a culture that rewarded merit instead of nepotism. I fired the people who had thrived on bullying and replaced them with competent managers who believed in the mission. I could have demolished the brand or stripped it of value to spite its former owner. That would have been the easy, shallow version of revenge, but what satisfied me more was watching it heal under principled leadership. Profits rose, employees who had been ghosted by the old guard found stability, and the company's reputation slowly shifted from arrogance to reliability. My name began to appear in industry notices not as an ex-son-in-law, but as a CEO who had turned around a complicated asset through smart governance and patience. People noticed, investors called, not because of scandal but because of consistent results. Employees who once ignored me sent private messages thanking me for respect and opportunity. The father-in-law, who had once believed fear of losing status was the only leash he needed on others, watched as the narrative he tried to control slipped from his fingers. He had built walls to protect his ego, but those walls also hid him from the humility that would have saved his company. Seeing him now was less about triumph and more about the quiet understanding that life levels things in its own way. I had no urge to gloat. The change I wanted was systemic, not personal. My success was the counterargument to their assumptions, the proof that resilience often looks boring and methodical: spreadsheets, late nights, honest hires, rather than explosive and theatrical. I won other things too: time I had wasted trying to be someone's idea of perfect, dignity reclaimed after being dismissed as expendable, and a new definition of family. My circle narrowed to people who earned their place, colleagues who stayed through the slow months, friends who congratulated me beyond surface politeness, mentors who taught me to treat success like stewardship. Occasionally, I allowed myself a private moment of incredulity: the boy who fixed bikes in the neighborhood, who had once been invisible at family gatherings, now negotiating multi-million deals. Those reveries were not about showing off, they were about gratitude for the brutal education that forged them. The anger that had once driven me ebbed into something steadier, determination anchored in the knowledge that my life was mine to construct. Revenge, in the way I wielded it, was never about obliteration. It was about reclaiming agency and demonstrating that your identity cannot be loaned or repossessed by someone who never understood your worth. It was exposing a truth the people who dismissed me refused to accept: that character is made in the aftermath of loss, not before it. I could have taken pleasure in watching them squirm, in making them feel the same humiliation I felt, but that would have left me hollow. Instead, I built something that outlived their petty cruelties: a business that provided jobs, a reputation that attracted honest people, and a life that no longer depended on their validation. Sometimes at night, when the city is quiet and the office lights are dim, I remember the exact look on my father-in-law's face the day I signed the acquisition papers: disbelief. Disbelief turning to the slow dawn of comprehension, and then acceptance that the game had changed. I remember my ex-wife's hesitant apology that never quite became one, her eyes saying what her mouth could not admit. I remember the silence after their departures, which at first was pain and later became permission to think for myself, to fail without shame, to rebuild without asking anyone for consent. That permission was the real victory. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is that the most devastating exits can be the entrance to your true life. The man I was when they left is not the man who signed those papers. The humiliation I carried became fuel, but not fuel for vengeance in the narrow sense. It became fuel for reinvention. I recreated myself on terms I set, surrounded by people I chose, running companies that reflected values I actually believed in. In the end, nuclear revenge wasn't about a single catastrophic strike. It was about an irreversible transformation so complete that the old pain lost its power to define me. That is the kind of comeback that leaves no scorched earth behind, only a stronger foundation for whatever comes next. So if you find yourself betrayed, dismissed, or abandoned, know this: your comeback does not have to be loud to be devastatingly effective. Build quietly, be relentless in learning, and steward what you create with integrity. The world will notice when you stop playing by their script and start writing your own.